Hello there, sixth graders. I'm here with a little video lesson to help you with your Unit 2 test this week. So you should have your Unit 2 test study guide. It's posted on the Google site. So you should go through there and find the answers to each of the questions that's on the study guide. You can go back into the Odysseyware lessons to find the answer. There's also a Quizlet there that'll give you some of the answers as well. But you'll see at the end of the study guide that there are 6 short answer questions that are posted on the Unit 2 test. You do not need to answer all 6 questions. You can look at the questions, figure out which ones you would most prefer to answer, and you're going to choose 3 out of the 6. The ones that you don't answer, you can leave blank. You don't need to type anything in. When I open it and I see a blank question, I'll hit the skip button for you, and I'll only grade the 3 that you have completed. So I put together some slides to go with all 6 questions to review them with you and give you some ideas about things that you might want to consider writing about in your short answers as sort of a video lesson. So you'll have to pick out of these. You don't need to do all of them. So for example, question number 36 asks, describe how Israel's past has influenced modern day Israel. And there's really a few things that you could write about for this particular question. One is that it wasn't really Israel. It was, for most of its history, the land that became Israel was Palestine. And you'll see up here on this map, you can see that. And it was predominantly, controlled by the Palestinian people, the Palestinian Muslims who lived there. And then in 1948 and 1949, the country of Israel was formed. And you can see that here on this map. And it was this orange piece of land right here was the original Israel, and this was its flag. And so the country of Israel was sort of made on land that had already been occupied by other groups of people. And then in 1967, they expanded from not just controlling only the blue land, but then the Israelis began occupying these 2 territories. So the country of Israel was formed and then has grown. And then you'll see in this last picture here, one of the ways in which that past has influenced modern day Israel is it is a country that has had a lot of fighting between the Palestinian Arabs and the Israelis. Those are the 2 groups that have primarily fought with each other over how this country is governed, who has rights in the country, where people should live in the country, and who gets to occupy the land. And the history of Israel, the past of Israel, has played a role in that. Another component to question number 36 is religion. And that goes back to that past of who lived there and who lives there now. So if you look back on this chart, you can see that the Arabs were the predominant population all the way up until the creation of Israel. And since then, the Jewish population has been the largest. Now, the Palestinian population today is starting to outnumber, not quite, but almost outnumber the Jewish population. But part of the past is having 2 religious groups and 2 different ethnic groups all living in one land. You have places like this, where you have a Christian church and this is the Dome of the Rock, all right, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Western Wall of Solomon's Jewish Temple, all in one location. So religion plays a role, and part of that too comes with the culture. In Israel, this is what your signs look like. It's in English, it's in Arabic, it's in Hebrew. And the government of Israel is predominantly controlled by Israeli Jews. And because of that, there's a lot of Jewish culture and a lot of Jewish history and political control. And that's okay, except for it doesn't always leave room for the Palestinian Arabs or other minority groups in this particular area. So the past of how Israel was created and the separation based on religion and ethnicity has really impacted modern Israel. So that's question number 36. Question number 37 is also on Israel. This one comes from the ideas of geography, and it's how have the Israelis adapted to living in the desert. So Israel is a very small country, and the entire southern half of it is desert. The northern part of Israel is actually pretty good in terms of its climate, but the southern part is limited. And so they have to try to find ways to live without a lot of water. Israel also only has one river, the Jordan River, that runs through it. So they don't have a lot of access to fresh water. So there are three great examples of how they've adapted to living in the desert with limited water. One is they have used technology to find wasteful water. So places where water is leaking out from pipes or from drains, or where water is just not being used effectively, they're using drones, they're using satellites, they're using cell phone technology to try to make sure they aren't losing water by not paying attention to where it is leaking. The second is they use a lot of drip irrigation. Instead of putting on a huge sprinkler and trying to water all of an entire field, which wastes a lot of water, you use these drip irrigation. It's a small thing that only provides water right where your plant is growing, instead of trying to water an entire yard, which would be wasteful. And then the last way in which Israel is adapting is through something called desalination. Desalination is a process in which you can take seawater that's salty, that you can't usually drink or use for irrigation. You process it through these big plants that look like this, and the water that comes out, you can drink and you can irrigate with and you can use. The problem with desalination is it's very expensive to do. So some countries can't do this. Israel has been able to. And they have 5 main plants along the Mediterranean Sea where they actually produce water by pumping the Mediterranean seawater into the plant, processing it, and then getting fresh water back out. So those are 3 great ways in which Israelis have adapted to living in the desert with limited water. Question number 38 asks to explain the effect religion has had on Egypt's school system. Well, religion is a very important component in all cultures, and in Egypt, it is particularly important. Egypt is a country that is predominantly Muslim, although they do have some other minority religions, but most people are Muslim in the country. And that has had a big effect on its school system. So one way is it's oftentimes, especially in middle school and high school, it's segregated by gender, where the boys will go to one school or stay in separate classes from the girls. That's not always true in elementary age, all right, or in some specialty schools like this one. But one way religion has had an impact is the segregation by gender. Egyptian schools are very well run. They have a very high literacy rate for young people, and they have both public schools, where like what we're used to, but they also have a lot of religious schools. That's another example of an effect that religion has had. They have a lot of private schools that are where they really push the Islamic religion because it's a private school, and many of those private schools also have religious instruction. So religion plays a really big important part in all culture, and it has the same in Egypt. Question 39 is also on Egypt, and it's about analyzing and describing the effects of multiculturalism on Egypt. Egypt has always been a country where there's been a lot of different people. Even back in the time of ancient Egypt, you had Africans, you had Arabs, you had people from Greece, you had people from the Sumerians, you had all these different ethnic groups that were all traveling to Egypt. So, the Hebrews lived there for a while. Like, there's been lots of different kinds of people who have lived in Egypt. That has brought a lot of positive effects. It's allowed them to develop a lot of trade. It's allowed them to develop a lot of, strong civilizations in ancient Egypt. It's allowed them to have a lot of very different types of people. Even Cleopatra is a great example of multiculturalism. She was a Greek, but she became the queen of Egypt, and she lived in Egypt. And so, it's still today, even though 90% of the people in Egypt are Muslim, there is a large 10% minority of Christians. They're known as the Copts, right here, the Egyptian Copt community. And it's a Christian community, and they continue to be an important part of the religious diversity that exists in parts of Egypt. And today, Egypt's multiculturalism, they kind of span Africa and Europe and the Middle East, and that's a positive effect for that country as well. Question number 40 asks you to compare and contrast the citizens' rights in India and China. And so I have on one half of the screen here China and then India on the other half. So in China, the rights are more limited because the Chinese government is run by one political party, which is the Chinese Communist Party. It means everything that is decided in China is made by the Communist Party. Now, a lot of the rules they used to have in China have gone away. For example, no longer does the Chinese government tell people they can only have 1 or 2 children. That law was ended a while ago. But there are still a lot of rules that the Chinese government has. For example, they censor the internet, which you can see down here. TikTok is not allowed in China, or Facebook, or any of those kind of social media platforms. They do have voting in China, but you don't have the freedom to vote for anyone because the only people who can run for office have to be from the Communist Party. So they don't have the right to have multiple political parties to choose from. They also do not have as many human rights. This is a picture of a group called the Uyghurs. They're a Muslim minority that lives in Western China who have been imprisoned by the Chinese government over the last few years. It is a lot easier to be imprisoned in China by the government than it would be in other countries. So there's not as many rights under the communist government of China. On the other side, we have India. India is a full democracy. It's actually one of the oldest and largest democracies in the world. And there you have all kinds of diverse people, but also you can see from this map, lots of different political parties that dominate. They have 2 big parties, but they also have other smaller political parties. Voting is a very popular thing in India. And generally speaking, in India, the government provides all the same kinds of fundamental rights that we would have here, to participate, to protest, to choose, what you want to do with your life. So those would be ways you could compare and contrast China and India. The last question is about limited government, and you need to choose 2 out of the 4. And then you will compare them. So one is an oligarchy. This is an example of China is oligarchy, when a small group, usually it's wealthy people or like a particular political party, like in communist China, rule. An absolute monarchy is when you have a king or a queen and they have all the power that runs the government, and there's no one else other than the monarch. It doesn't have to be a king or a queen. For example, this is Oman's sultan. He's basically their king. They just call him a sultan. Could be an emperor. It could be, there's lots of different titles that could be given. Doesn't have to be specifically king and queen, but a monarch is a person who rules through their entire power, and nothing else exists. The last 2 is a constitutional monarchy and a dictatorship. A constitutional monarchy has the king and the queen. In this case, this is England's queen. So they have the monarchy part, but they add an actual elected government. So this would be the parliament, for example, in Great Britain. So the parliament actually runs the country. The queen is there. She's sort of important, but not really important when it comes to political power. She does not make the rules. And there's an elected parliament and a constitution that limits, you'll see here, it has a limited power versus an absolute monarchy where the monarch has full power. The 4th one that you could choose is a dictatorship. And in a dictatorship, you basically have one person, maybe sometimes a few people, but usually it's one person who controls the entirety of the military and controls the entirety of the government. And there are very few other people who are able to participate. Kim Jong-un, for example, is considered the dictator of North Korea. He is the all-powerful person that runs the country. Everyone else is sort of put to the side. Adolf Hitler is considered a dictator when he ruled Germany, or Stalin when he ruled Russia. So those would be some examples of those. So just lastly, and I only have about 30 seconds left here, you're going to pick 3 out of the 6. Do not do all 6. And then for each of the 3 you pick, you should be writing 4 to 6 good sentences. It shouldn't just be a 1 or 2 sentence because I'm letting you pick which ones you're doing. So you want to make sure you really get in there and find some good ideas, jot some things down on your study guide, and make sure you write it on your own with your resources, and use the RACE strategy to try to make sure you restate, answer, cite, and explain. If you've got other questions, please let me know, but hopefully this is helpful and will help you do well.